The worst betrayal isn't when strangers disrespect you. It's when family starts acting like your life already belongs to them. I realized that on a rainy Saturday afternoon while standing outside Bloomfield Plaza with cold raindrops sliding down the back of my coat collar. I had only gone there because my blood pressure prescription was ready early, and my neighbor Carol had dropped me off since my own car was supposedly sitting safely in my garage at home. At least that's what I believed. But halfway across the parking lot, I froze so suddenly that a young man pushing a stroller nearly bumped into me. Because parked directly in front of Maison Elegante, the most expensive boutique in the entire plaza, was my silver Lexus RX 350. My car. My stomach tightened instantly. I recognized the tiny scratch near the rear bumper from where Ethan had backed into our mailbox 3 winters ago during an ice storm. There was no mistake. That was my Lexus. And standing beside it, laughing while holding shopping bags, was my daughter-in-law Vanessa. Her mother Patricia stood next to her wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying what looked like at least 4 department store bags. Her father Ron was loading boxes into my trunk like he had every right in the world to use it. Vanessa flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and hit the lock button on my key fob without a trace of guilt. The headlights flashed. My headlights. I just stood there under the gray sky, gripping my pharmacy bag tighter and tighter while traffic rolled through the wet parking lot behind me. Vanessa never asked to borrow my car. Not once. She'd sent me a text at 9 that morning that simply said, "Borrowed your Lexus for the day. Taking my parents around town." Borrowed. Like it was a sweater. Like it was normal. Like I was some elderly woman too harmless to object anymore. I wish I could tell you that moment shocked me completely, but the truth is worse. It didn't. Because by then, Vanessa had already spent 3 years slowly pushing every boundary I had left. First it was little things. Rearranging furniture in my own living room while saying she was helping modernize the house. Then it became using my kitchen appliances without asking, inviting her friends over for wine nights, and referring to my home as our place whenever people visited. Every single time I felt uncomfortable, Ethan would smile tiredly and say, "Mom, she means well." But after my husband Walter passed away 5 years earlier, I had learned something painful about grief. People stop seeing widows as full people. Especially older widows. They start seeing empty spaces. Assets. Opportunities. Things waiting to be inherited. And Vanessa was very good at spotting opportunities. I watched her laugh as Patricia adjusted her scarf dramatically and pointed toward another store. Vanessa immediately grabbed my car keys from her purse and said something that made all 3 of them laugh. Then Patricia said it. The sentence that changed everything for me. "Honestly, sweetheart, once Margaret passes, this lifestyle will finally be yours anyway." Vanessa smirked. Then she casually answered, "I know. Ethan keeps saying she doesn't even drive that much anymore." My entire body went cold. Not angry at first. Cold. Because suddenly every uncomfortable feeling I'd been swallowing for years finally had a shape. They weren't treating me like family. They were treating me like a temporary obstacle. An old woman occupying space they already imagined belonged to them. I should have walked over immediately. Part of me wanted to. But instead I stayed where I was beneath the drizzle, watching them with a kind of heartbreaking clarity I wish I'd had sooner. Vanessa opened my trunk and tossed shopping bags inside carelessly. One bag tipped sideways against the emergency blanket I kept folded in the back from when Walter was alive. Walter always believed in being prepared. Snowstorms. Flat tires. Dead batteries. He used to say, "A car tells you a lot about a person, Maggie. Watch how they treat things that aren't technically theirs." I remembered that while watching Vanessa slam my trunk shut hard enough to shake the vehicle. My chest tightened painfully. Not because of the car itself. I could buy another car if I wanted to. That wasn't the point. The point was what it represented. Respect. Permission. Boundaries. Things that had quietly disappeared from my own life while I kept trying to keep the peace. I finally stepped forward when Vanessa spotted me standing near the pharmacy entrance. Her smile disappeared instantly. "Margaret," she said sharply, like I was the inconvenience. Patricia turned around slowly, her expression stiffening beneath layers of makeup. Ron suddenly became very interested in rearranging shopping bags. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa asked. Not hello. Not sorry. Not even an explanation. I looked directly at my Lexus before answering. I could ask you the same thing. Vanessa let out a quick laugh. Seriously? We're just shopping. She jingled my keys casually. You weren't using the car today. There it was again. That tone. Like my ownership only mattered if it was convenient for them. I stayed calm. You didn't ask. Vanessa rolled her eyes slightly and crossed her arms. We're family, Margaret. Family. Funny how people use that word most when they want access to something that isn't theirs. Patricia stepped closer beside her daughter and gave me a smile so fake it practically cracked in the rain. Vanessa said you wouldn't mind. I looked at Vanessa carefully then. Really looked at her. Perfect manicure. Expensive coat. My car keys dangling from her fingers like trophies. And for the first time I noticed something underneath all the polished charm she showed the outside world. Entitlement.
Pure entitlement.
She genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong. That realization hurt far more than anger would have. Because entitlement doesn't appear overnight. It grows when people keep getting away with crossing lines. And suddenly I realized something even more painful. I had helped create this situation by staying quiet every time she crossed one. Vanessa sighed dramatically when I didn't answer fast enough. Can we not make this awkward? She muttered. Awkward? My late husband's car. My insurance. My property taxes paying for the house she lived in. My retirement savings covering half the utility bills Ethan always forgot. Yet somehow I was the awkward one for expecting basic respect. I glanced toward the Lexus again as rainwater rolled slowly across the windshield. Then I looked back at Vanessa and smiled softly, calmly, the kind of smile people mistake for surrender. Of course, I said gently. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Vanessa relaxed immediately. Patricia smirked faintly beside her. They thought they had won something in that moment. Access. Control. Permission without needing to ask. But as I turned away toward the pharmacy exit, something inside me had already changed permanently. Because for the first time in years I stopped trying to convince myself their behavior was harmless. And once a woman finally sees the truth clearly, she stops reacting emotionally. She starts paying attention. There is something deeply humiliating about realizing people have stopped seeing you as the owner of your own life while you are still standing right in front of them. I sat quietly in Carol's passenger seat on the drive home that afternoon while rain tapped against the windshield in slow, uneven rhythms. Carol kept chatting about grocery prices and her grandson's baseball tournament, but I barely heard a word she said. My mind stayed fixed on Vanessa's voice in that parking lot. We are family, Margaret. Funny how those words always seem to appear right before somebody crossed another line. When we pulled into my driveway 20 minutes later, my garage sat empty and cold. Seeing that open space where my Lexus should have been affected me more than I expected. Not because of the car itself, because suddenly the entire house felt different. Smaller somehow. Less mine. I thanked Carol politely and carried my pharmacy bag inside. The smell of vanilla candles hit me immediately. Vanessa's candles. She always burned those overly sweet expensive candles she bought online, even though I had told her several times strong fragrances gave me headaches. But of course she kept doing it because Vanessa treated preferences like obstacles instead of boundaries. I stepped into the kitchen and found decorative pumpkins spread across my dining table, even though it was still only September. Another Vanessa touch. She had slowly redecorated half the downstairs over the last 2 years without ever directly asking permission. New throw pillows. New curtains. Different dishes in my cabinets. Tiny little changes that by themselves seemed too small to confront. But together they created an unmistakable message. This house was already becoming hers in her mind. I stood at the sink staring out the kitchen window for a long moment before I heard Ethan come downstairs. Hey Mom, he said casually while looking at his phone. Did Vanessa text you? They are still shopping. I turned around slowly. Ethan looked exhausted as usual. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkled polo shirt from another 10-hour shift at the insurance office. My son had once been thoughtful and observant when he was younger. But somewhere over the years, avoiding conflict had become his entire personality. She did text me, I said calmly. Ethan nodded distractedly and opened the refrigerator. Good. That was it. No concern. No epaleji. Not even basic acknowledgement that his wife had taken my vehicle without permission. I watched him pull out bottled water while memories flashed through my mind so quickly they almost made me dizzy. Ethan at 8 years old helping Walter wash the Lexus in the driveway every Sunday morning. Ethan at 16 asking nervously if he could borrow the car for prom night. Ethan at 25 crying in my kitchen after Vanessa left him during one of their early breakups because she thought he lacked ambition. Back then I had defended her. She is young, I told Walter. She will mature. Walter only looked at me over his newspaper and said quietly, Maggie, some people do not grow gratitude. They grow expectations. At the time I thought he was being too harsh. Now I wondered if he had seen everything years before I did. Ethan leaned against the counter and finally looked up from his phone. Vanessa said you ran into them at Bloomfield. I did. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Mom. She was just trying to do something nice for her parents. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence. Doing something nice for her parents using my property while disrespecting me somehow still became something I was expected to tolerate gracefully. Ethan, I asked softly, did she ask before taking my car? His silence answered before his mouth did. She assumed it would be okay. Assumed. Another word people use when they do not want accountability attached to their actions. I folded my hands carefully on the counter. Would she be comfortable if I walked into her office and took her laptop because I assumed it would be okay? Ethan sighed heavily like I was making life difficult unnecessarily. That is different. Why? He opened his mouth then closed it again. Because deep down he knew there was no real difference. Only convenience. But convenience has ruined more family relationships than cruelty ever has. Cruel people at least show you who they are openly. Convenient people slowly train you to accept disrespect one small compromise at a time. Ethan grabbed his water bottle and looked toward the stairs. You are overthinking this. That sentence settled something inside me permanently. Overthinking. That was the label women like me received whenever we noticed patterns people benefited from ignoring. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Ethan relaxed immediately at my calm tone. He kissed the top of my head distractedly like he used to when he wanted conversations to end quickly. Try not to stress yourself out, okay? Then he disappeared upstairs while I remained standing alone in my own kitchen. A few minutes later I heard Vanessa's laugh echo through the front hallway before the door swung open loudly. Shopping bags rustled everywhere. Patricia's voice floated inside dramatically complaining about the rain ruining her hair. Vanessa entered first carrying designer bags while Ethan hurried downstairs to help her unload. Nobody acknowledged me initially. They moved through the house with the confidence of people returning to a place they believed belonged to them. You should have seen the sale at Brighton Avenue, Patricia said while removing her coat. Vanessa found the cutest serving trays. Vanessa laughed proudly. Margaret has plenty of cabinet space for them. My chest tightened again. Not because of the trays. Because she had not said your cabinets. She said Margaret has cabinet space. Like she was talking about a storage unit she managed. Ron carried several shopping bags directly through my dining room without asking where to place them. Wet footprints streaked across the hardwood floor. Walter refinished himself before he died. I watched quietly as Vanessa tossed my Lexus keys onto the kitchen island beside my mail. Thanks again for letting us use the car, she called casually while checking her reflection in the microwave door. I stared at those keys for several seconds. Then I picked them up slowly and slipped them into my sweater pocket. Vanessa noticed immediately. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Tiny reaction. Most people would miss it. I did not. Because people become very attentive the moment access changes. Everything okay? She asked carefully. Of course, I answered pleasantly. I am simply putting my keys away. Patricia exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa that lasted less than a second. But it told me everything. They were uncomfortable now. Not guilty. Not embarrassed. Uncomfortable. Because suddenly I was behaving like the actual owner again. That evening during dinner, Vanessa dominated the conversation the way she always did. Stories about restaurants, vacation ideas, complaints about coworkers, plans for future renovations she wanted for the house. Ethan nodded along automatically while Patricia encouraged every idea enthusiastically. I barely spoke. Instead I listened. Really listened. And once you stop defending people in your own mind, you begin hearing truths they accidentally reveal. Vanessa referred to the upstairs guest room as our future office. Patricia mentioned property taxes and asked whether I had updated my will recently. Ron joked about how useful the Lexus would be once winter arrived because it handled snow well. Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody asked how I felt. Because somewhere along the way they had quietly stopped factoring me into the future at all. That night, after everyone finally went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room beneath the soft yellow lamp Walter used to read beside every evening. The house felt strangely silent despite for other people sleeping inside it. I looked toward the framed photo of Walter smiling, beside the Lexus the year we bought it. Then I whispered something I had not admitted out loud until that moment. They think I am already gone. And once I finally said the words, I realized something even more important. I was done trying to prove otherwise. The strange thing about finally losing respect for someone is how peaceful you become afterward. Not happy, not angry, just clear. Sunday morning arrived quiet and gray, and for the first time in years, I stopped waking up with the instinct to make everyone else comfortable before myself. I sat alone at the kitchen table before sunrise with a cup of black coffee while the house remained silent upstairs. The refrigerator hummed softly. Rain tapped against the windows again. Walter used to love mornings like that. He always said rainy mornings force people to slow down enough to notice things they normally ignored. I think that was exactly what was happening to me. I noticed everything now. The expensive handbag Vanessa had left hanging over one of my dining chairs as if the house were her personal hotel. The package deliveries arriving almost daily under Ethan's name even though I knew their finances were strained. The way Vanessa had started using the phrase our future, whenever she talked about renovations, vacations, or furniture purchases. Every detail suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle I had spent years pretending not to see. Around 8 o'clock I heard footsteps upstairs followed by Vanessa's laugh drifting down the hallway. A few minutes later she walked into the kitchen wearing cream-colored loungewear and carrying her phone in one hand while scrolling social media with the other. "Morning," she said absent-mindedly before opening the refrigerator. She did not ask if I wanted breakfast. She did not acknowledge yesterday's tension. Vanessa's greatest talent was acting as though uncomfortable moments disappeared automatically if she ignored them long enough. "Morning," I replied calmly. She pulled almond milk from the refrigerator and frowned at the nearly empty carton. "Ethan drank the rest again," she muttered. Then she looked toward me. "Do you mind picking some up later if you go out?" There it was again. That assumption. Not a request. An expectation. Like my time naturally existed to support her routines. "I do mind," I answered politely before sipping my coffee. Vanessa blinked once in surprise. Oh, that tiny word carried more confusion than offense. Because people who are accustomed to constant accommodation become genuinely disoriented by boundaries. She recovered quickly with a tight smile. "Okay, no problem." But I noticed the shift immediately. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. Her eyes narrowed for half a second before she returned her attention to her phone. Tiny reactions. Tiny cracks. I had started noticing all of them now. Ethan came downstairs shortly afterward still half asleep and kissed Vanessa on the cheek before grabbing cereal from the pantry. "What time are your parents coming over?" he asked. Vanessa leaned against the counter. "Probably around noon. Dad wants to watch football." Ethan nodded casually like this had always been the plan. Nobody had mentioned visitors to me. Again, the fact itself no longer surprised me. What surprised me was realizing how often it had happened before without me fully acknowledging how disrespectful it was. My own home had slowly become a place where plans happened around me instead of with me. "Actually," I said gently, "I was planning on having a quiet afternoon today." Ethan looked up immediately. Vanessa stayed silent. "Oh," Ethan said awkwardly. "Well, they already said they were coming." I folded my hands together calmly. Then perhaps next time someone should ask before inviting guests into my house. Silence settled across the kitchen instantly. Vanessa finally looked at me fully now. Not annoyed. Evaluating. Like she was trying to decide whether this new version of me was temporary. "Margaret," she said carefully. "They are family." I almost smiled at how predictable that word had become. Family. The universal excuse for disrespect without accountability. And I am the homeowner, I answered softly. Ethan sighed heavily. Mom, why are we suddenly making everything a problem? Suddenly. Another fascinating word. Because disrespect only feels sudden to the people benefiting from it. To the person enduring it, the buildup usually lasts years. I looked directly at my son. I am not making problems, Ethan. I am noticing them. His expression shifted slightly then. Confusion mixed with discomfort. Because deep down Ethan knew I was right. But acknowledging that truth would force him to confront something he had avoided for years. His wife did not simply overlook boundaries. She erased them whenever they became inconvenient. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. Nobody is trying to disrespect you. No. I asked quietly. Then why does everyone in this house keep making decisions involving my belongings, my schedule, and my property without asking me first? Neither of them answered immediately. That silence spoke louder than any argument could have. Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. Can we not do this today? There it was again. Avoidance. Ethan treated accountability like bad weather. Something uncomfortable you waited to pass instead of addressing directly. Vanessa stepped in smoothly before he had to continue. She always did that. Look, if the car thing upset you so much, I said thank you. The fact that she believed gratitude erased entitlement told me everything I needed to know. That was not the issue, I replied calmly. The issue was permission. Vanessa laughed once under her breath. Not kindly. I think you are being a little dramatic. Dramatic. Another word women hear whenever they stop accepting disrespect quietly. I set my coffee cup down carefully. Perhaps. Then I stood and carried my cup toward the sink. The conversation ended there because I decided to end it. And strangely enough, that seemed to unsettle Vanessa more than any argument would have. She was accustomed to emotional reactions. Defensiveness. Hurt feelings. Explanations. But calmness removes the control manipulative people rely on. Around noon, Patricia and Ron arrived carrying bakery boxes and football snacks like they owned the place already. Patricia swept through the front door without knocking properly and immediately started discussing curtain colors for the downstairs den. This room would look so much brighter with cream linen panels, she announced while removing her coat. Vanessa and I were talking about it yesterday. Vanessa smiled proudly from the kitchen. I found some online already. I sat quietly in Walter's leather chair pretending to read while listening carefully. Nobody included me in the discussion. Nobody asked whether I wanted new curtains. They simply talked around me as though the transition of ownership had already emotionally occurred. Ethan turned the television on while Ron settled onto the couch with complete familiarity. This house has great bones, Ron commented casually. You could really increase the value with a few updates. I slowly lowered my book. Interesting, I said politely. Since I am not selling it. Ron chuckled awkwardly while Patricia suddenly became fascinated with rearranging napkins on the coffee table. Vanessa shot Ethan a quick glance. Again, tiny reactions. Tiny discomfort. Because every time I calmly reminded them that the house, the car, and the decision still belonged to me, the fantasy they had built in their heads became harder to maintain. Later that afternoon I walked upstairs to retrieve an old photo album from the hallway closet when I noticed something strange. The small lockbox where I kept copies of important documents sat slightly crooked on the shelf. Most people would never have noticed. But Walter and I had kept that box in the exact same position for over 15 years. I stepped closer slowly. The lock remained closed. But when I lifted the lid after entering the code, several folders inside were no longer arranged correctly. My vehicle registration folder sat on top instead of underneath the insurance documents where I always kept it. A cold feeling spread through my stomach instantly. Someone had gone through my paperwork. Carefully. Quietly. Recently. I stood there frozen for several seconds while muffled football commentary echoed downstairs. Then I noticed something else. The spare Lexus key was gone. Nothing changes your understanding of people faster than discovering they have been preparing for ownership before you are even gone. I stood alone in that upstairs hallway closet staring at the empty space where the spare Lexus key had been for nearly 8 years. At first, I actually questioned myself. Aging teaches you to doubt your own memory before you doubt other people. I remember standing there thinking perhaps I moved it myself months ago. Perhaps I placed it somewhere safer and forgot. But deep down I already knew the truth. Walter had always teased me about my organization habits. Every important document in our house had its place. Insurance papers, mortgage records, tax returns, spare keys. I had not touched that lockbox in over 3 months. And now suddenly folders were rearranged and the backup key was missing only one day after Vanessa casually took my car without permission. That was not coincidence. That was preparation. I closed the box slowly and returned everything exactly as I found it. Then I stood very still listening to the muffled sounds downstairs. Football commentators yelling through the television. Patricia laughing loudly at something Vanessa said. Dishes clinking in my kitchen. My kitchen. Strange how ownership can begin feeling fragile when enough people behave as though your boundaries no longer matter. I walked downstairs calmly carrying the photo album I had originally gone upstairs to retrieve. Nobody noticed the expression on my face. Vanessa sat curled beside Ethan on the couch scrolling through furniture websites on her tablet, while Patricia leaned over pointing at pictures. This sectional would open the room so much more, Patricia said. Especially once the downstairs becomes yours to redesign fully. Vanessa smiled. Exactly what I was thinking. I lowered myself slowly into Walter's leather chair across the room. Interesting conversation, I said quietly. Silence fell immediately. Vanessa glanced up first. We were just talking about decorating ideas. Decorating ideas. That was how they framed everything. Soft language. Harmless language. Language designed to make objections sound unreasonable. For whose house? I asked calmly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably before Vanessa answered. Margaret, nobody is trying to upset you. I looked directly at her. That was not my question. Patricia suddenly became fascinated with adjusting her bracelet. Ron kept staring at the television without moving. Vanessa forced a small laugh. Obviously we mean eventually. Years from now. Eventually. There it was again. That assumption hiding beneath polite wording. The belief that my future had already been quietly scheduled around their expectations. I nodded slowly. I see. Then I opened the photo album on my lap and pretended to study old family pictures while the room filled with uncomfortable silence. But inside something had become crystal clear. They no longer viewed me as an active participant in my own life. I was becoming an obstacle standing between them and the lifestyle they imagined inheriting. Later that evening, after Patricia and Ron finally left, I noticed Vanessa lingering near the kitchen island while Ethan took a work call upstairs. She watched me carefully while I rinsed coffee cups. Are you upset with me? She finally asked. Her tone sounded softer than usual, but I recognized it immediately. It was not concern. It was strategy. Vanessa preferred emotional confusion over direct confrontation, because confusion gave her room to reshape situations afterward. Should I be? I asked without turning around. She sighed dramatically. I feel like you have been cold to me all weekend. I dried my hands slowly before facing her. You took my vehicle without permission. Someone went through my lockbox upstairs. And now your parents speak openly about redesigning my home, as though I am not living in it. Her face changed for just a fraction of a second when I mentioned the lockbox. Tiny reaction. Tiny confirmation. Then her expression smoothed out instantly. Nobody went through your things, she replied too quickly. Really? I asked calmly. Then where is the spare Lexus key? That landed harder than I expected. Vanessa blinked once and looked away briefly toward the hallway. I do not know. Lie. A clean polished lie delivered with practiced ease. But what interested me most was not the dishonesty itself. It was how unbothered she seemed by it. Vanessa behaved like someone who believed accountability would never truly apply to her inside this house. If the key suddenly appears, I said quietly, I would appreciate having it returned. Her jaw tightened slightly. You are making this into something weird. There it was again. Weird. Dramatic. Overthinking. Every boundary became irrational the moment it inconvenienced her.
No, iyan suarat sufli.
I think I am finally seeing things clearly. Vanessa stared at me carefully then. For the first time since she married Ethan, I think she realized something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was observing. And people who rely on entitlement become deeply uncomfortable once they realize they are being observed clearly. She crossed her arms. I think you resent that Ethan and I are building a future together. The sentence almost impressed me with its manipulation. She reframed disrespect as insecurity. Clever. Very clever. But too late. Your future should not require ownership over my present, I replied calmly. Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped, because there was no easy way to twist that sentence into something unreasonable. Ethan returned downstairs moments later carrying his phone. Everything okay? He asked immediately, sensing tension. Vanessa answered before I could. Your mom thinks somebody stole her spare key. Ethan sighed heavily like a man already exhausted by inconvenience. Mom, maybe you misplaced it. I looked directly at him for several seconds. Do you really believe that? He hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than an outright lie would have. Because Ethan knew exactly how organized I was. He knew Walter and I treated important documents carefully. He knew I was not confused or forgetful. But believing me would require confronting his wife. And Ethan had spent years choosing comfort over truth whenever those two things collided. I just think everybody needs to relax, he muttered finally. Relax. Another fascinating word people use when they benefit from someone else staying silent. I nodded once. Of course. Vanessa relaxed visibly the moment I stopped pushing. Again, she mistook calmness for surrender. That was becoming her biggest mistake. That night I stayed awake long after the house became quiet. Around 1 a.m. I walked softly downstairs for tea and noticed a faint light glowing beneath the garage entry door. I paused immediately. Someone was in the garage. I moved closer silently and heard Vanessa's voice murmuring softly. First I thought she was on the phone. Then I heard the distinct electronic chirp of car locks engaging. My stomach tightened. I opened the door slowly. Vanessa stood beside my Lexus wearing pajamas and holding something behind her back. Her eyes widened instantly when she saw me. You scared me, she said quickly. I looked at the vehicle. The driver door stood slightly open. What are you doing? I asked calmly. Nothing, she answered too fast. I thought I left my sunglasses in here. At 1 a.m. In pajamas. Inside my garage. I said nothing. We simply stared at each other across the cold concrete floor while the garage light hummed overhead. Then she smiled tightly and walked past me toward the house. But as she passed, I noticed what she had been holding. My spare Lexus key. Some people think betrayal begins with cruelty. It does not. Real betrayal begins with comfort. Comfort taking what is not yours. Comfort crossing lines because nobody stops you. Comfort believing another person will continue tolerating disrespect simply because they always have before. I barely slept after seeing the spare Lexus key in Vanessa's hand that night. But strangely enough, I was not emotional anymore. I was alert. There is a dangerous calm that arrives when disappointment finally replaces hope. Around 6 a.m. I heard the shower upstairs turn on, followed by cabinet doors opening and closing in the bathroom Ethan and Vanessa used. I stayed downstairs making tea while the house slowly woke around me. The sky outside remained dark blue from early dawn, and the kitchen felt unusually cold despite the heater running. I sat quietly at the table with Walter's old leather notebook open in front of me. It was where he used to keep reminders, account numbers, and maintenance schedules for the house. Over the years I had added my own notes to it after he passed. Property taxes, insurance renewals, vehicle service appointments. But that morning I started writing something different. Dates, conversations, incidents, the missing spare key, Vanessa taking the Lexus without permission, Patricia discussing future renovations. Every detail, calmly, carefully, because once people begin acting entitled to your life, documentation becomes wisdom. At 7:30 Vanessa entered the kitchen already dressed for the day in white sneakers and an expensive beige trench coat. She smiled too brightly when she saw me sitting there. You are up early, she said casually while reaching for the coffee maker. Could not sleep, I answered. She nodded once but avoided eye contact. Interesting. Guilt changes body language, even when words remain confident. I found my sunglasses, by the way. she said after a moment. They were in the garage. I looked directly at her. I noticed. Her hand paused briefly on the coffee pot before continuing again. Tiny reaction. Then she forced another smile. I think one of your neighbors left the side garage door cracked yesterday. I just wanted to make sure everything was secure. Such a polished explanation. So thoughtful on the surface. But what fascinated me was how quickly she constructed narratives whenever accountability approached. Vanessa never apologized first. She explained first. How considerate, I said softly. Again, she studied my face carefully, trying to understand why I no longer reacted emotionally. Manipulative people become uneasy when they lose the ability to predict your feelings. Ethan came downstairs shortly afterward, adjusting his tie while checking emails on his phone. Morning, he muttered distractedly. Vanessa handed him coffee immediately before he even asked. Small gestures like that were part of why Ethan defended her constantly. Vanessa knew how to make herself appear supportive, while quietly controlling the emotional climate around her. Dad wants to borrow the Lexus later, she said casually while stirring cream into her coffee. He and Mom want to drive down to Brookhaven Outlet before dinner. Ethan nodded automatically. Makes sense. Then both of them realized something at the same time. The kitchen became very still. Because this time nobody had asked me. They had simply spoken as though access already existed. Vanessa recovered first. If that is okay with you, she added quickly. There it was. Not respect. Correction. She had not forgotten permission mattered. She simply forgot until silence reminded her. I folded my hands together calmly. No, Ethan blinked immediately. Vanessa stared at me. No, she repeated. Correct, I answered pleasantly. The vehicle will not be available today. The silence that followed felt almost surreal. Not because my answer was rude. Because it was unfamiliar. Vanessa laughed lightly at first, like she assumed I was joking. But when I did not smile back, the tension shifted instantly. Margaret, she said carefully, my parents already made plans. Then they should use their own vehicle, I replied. Ethan finally looked up from his phone completely now. Mom, come on. That phrase. Two simple words carrying decades of expectation. Come on. Be flexible. Be generous. Be quiet. I looked directly at my son. Your wife took my car all weekend without permission. Someone removed my spare key from a locked box. And now her parents expect ongoing access to my vehicle as though it belongs to the family. Ethan rubbed his forehead immediately. Nobody stole your key. I held his gaze steadily. Then where was it last night? He said nothing. Because Ethan knew Vanessa had no reason to be standing in the garage after midnight with my spare key in her hand. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. I already explained that.
No, iyan suarat sufli.
You attempted to explain it. Her jaw tightened. I feel like you are accusing me of something. Interesting, I said calmly. You seem very uncomfortable for someone who did nothing wrong. That landed harder than I intended. Vanessa's cheeks flushed slightly while Ethan shifted awkwardly beside her. Again, no yelling.
No dramatica enfrentación.
Just truth sitting heavily in the room where nobody wanted it. Ethan finally exhaled sharply. This is getting ridiculous. Is it? I asked. Because from my perspective, what seems ridiculous is how comfortable everyone became making decisions about my belongings without involving me. Vanessa grabbed her coffee cup abruptly. I do not have time for this before work. Then she turned and walked upstairs without another word. But I noticed something important as she left. She looked angry now, not confident. And there is a major difference between those emotions. Confidence believes it controls the situation. Anger appears when control begins slipping away. Ethan remained standing awkwardly near the counter after she left. You are making things harder than they need to be, he muttered quietly. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Do you know what hurts most? He sighed tiredly. Mom. Not the car, I continued calmly. Not the key. Not even the disrespect. What hurts most is realizing my own son watches all of this happen and keeps asking me to tolerate it so nobody else feels uncomfortable. Ethan's expression changed then. Just slightly. Enough for me to see guilt finally breaking through the fog of avoidance. But guilt without action changes nothing. Vanessa is trying to build a life with me, he said softly. And I spent my entire life building one for you, I replied. Silence filled the kitchen again. Ethan looked down at the floor like he suddenly could not bear eye contact anymore. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment. Almost. Because weakness inside families can become just as destructive as selfishness. Around noon I drove the Lexus myself for the first time since Saturday. The leather still carried Vanessa's perfume faintly inside the cabin. Shopping receipts littered the center console. The gas tank sat nearly empty. I parked in the lot outside Hamilton and Myers Legal Services downtown and remained sitting behind the steering wheel for several moments before turning the engine off. Walter's old attorney, Richard Myers, still worked there despite being well into his 70s now. I had not seen him since Walter's estate paperwork years earlier. But as I stared up at the office building, one sentence repeated quietly inside my mind. People who stop respecting your boundaries eventually start testing your ownership. And I suddenly realized I was done waiting to see how far that testing would go. Richard Myers looked older than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp in the way only experienced attorneys and old soldiers manage to preserve. He stood from behind his mahogany desk the moment I entered his office and smiled warmly. Margaret Whitmore, he said gently. You still walk exactly like Walter did when something was bothering him. I almost laughed at that. Walter always walked faster when he was upset, like motion itself could solve problems quicker. Richard shook my hand and motioned for me to sit near the window overlooking downtown Brookhaven. His office smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and leather furniture polished over decades. Familiar. Stable. The kind of room where people came when life stopped feeling secure. How have you been? He asked once his assistant brought tea. I looked down at the steaming cup for a moment before answering honestly. I think I have been asleep for several years. Richard leaned back quietly without interrupting. Good attorneys understand the value of silence better than most people. Walter used to tell me something, I continued softly. He said that when people stop respecting your boundaries, they eventually stop respecting your ownership too. Richard's expression shifted slightly at that. And now you believe that is happening? I nodded slowly. Then for the next 40 minutes I told him everything. The Lexus. Vanessa taking it without permission. The missing spare key. The lockbox. The comments about future renovations. Patricia speaking openly as though my life were already ending. Ethan dismissing every concern as overthinking. Richard listened without interrupting once. Not one time. When I finally finished, he folded his hands together thoughtfully. Margaret, he said carefully, what you are describing is not uncommon. Something about hearing that unsettled me deeply. Not uncommon. Meaning there were countless other older people sitting inside homes they legally owned while slowly becoming emotionally erased inside them. You are saying this happens often? I asked quietly. Richard nodded once. Very often after the death of a spouse. Family dynamics change. Boundaries become blurred. Adult children begin viewing parents less as independent individuals and more as transitional figures. Transitional figures. Such a clean professional phrase for something so painful. But this situation concerns me for another reason, Richard continued. He reached for a legal pad beside him. Has anyone besides you had direct access to your financial paperwork? Apparently, I answered dryly. Richard gave a small humorless smile. Then we need to verify several things immediately. Over the next hour he walked me through questions I had not even considered. Had anyone been added to my insurance policies? Had I checked my property records recently? Were any documents missing besides the spare key? Did Ethan or Vanessa have access to my banking mail? Each question tightened the knot in my stomach further because the truth was uncomfortable. I had trusted proximity more than I trusted boundaries. Richard eventually removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Margaret, I need you to understand something clearly. Generosity without structure creates entitlement. And entitlement escalates. That sentence sat heavily in the room. Because deep down I already knew it was true. Richard handed me a folder. First, we verify all ownership documents. Second, we protect your assets legally. Third, we establish clear boundaries immediately. You make it sound like I am preparing for war, I said softly. Richard's expression remained calm. No. I think you are preparing to stop being erased. I left his office just after noon carrying a stack of updated paperwork instructions and a strange sense of clarity I had not felt in years. The rain had finally stopped outside, leaving downtown streets shining silver beneath cloudy skies. As I walked toward the Lexus, I noticed something immediately. My driver's seat had been moved again.
Teeny detail.
Most people would ignore it. But Walter was 6 feet tall and I was 5'4". I always kept the seat position close to the steering wheel. Now it sat farther back. Someone had driven my vehicle recently besides me. I sat silently behind the wheel for several moments before turning the ignition on. Then another thing caught my attention. The fuel level. Nearly full. That made no sense. Yesterday the tank had been almost empty after Vanessa and her parents spent the weekend driving all over town. Slowly, carefully, I opened the center console. Inside sat a folded receipt from Ridgeway Auto Plaza gas station dated early that morning at 12:43 a.m. My stomach tightened instantly. Vanessa had been out driving my Lexus after midnight, while I slept upstairs believing the vehicle was safely parked inside my garage. I stared at the receipt for a long moment while cold realization settled over me piece by piece. She had not gone into the garage looking for sunglasses. She had returned from somewhere. Somewhere she had gone using my vehicle without permission again. I drove home quietly with the receipt folded inside my purse. When I pulled into the driveway, Ethan's sedan sat parked near the curb while Vanessa's white SUV remained in the garage. But my garage door stood slightly open again. Careless. Or comfortable. I entered through the kitchen and immediately heard Vanessa laughing upstairs on the phone. No, she is just being sensitive lately, she said loudly enough for her voice to drift down the hallway. Honestly, I think she is lonely more than anything. I stopped walking. Sensitive. Lonely. Amazing how quickly people transform your boundaries into emotional instability once you stop complying quietly. Eventually Ethan and I will probably need more space anyway, Vanessa continued. This house could easily be remodeled if we open the downstairs. I stood perfectly still listening while something inside me hardened permanently. Not emotionally. Structurally. Like concrete setting. Vanessa was no longer merely crossing boundaries. She was planning around my future absence while still living comfortably off my present stability. A few minutes later she came downstairs wearing workout clothes and nearly jumped when she saw me standing near the island. Oh, she said quickly. I did not hear you come in. Clearly, I answered softly. She grabbed a water bottle from the refrigerator while carefully avoiding eye contact. How was your day? Productive. She nodded absent-mindedly. Good. Then her eyes shifted briefly. Toward my purse resting on the counter. Tiny movement. Tiny curiosity. Again I noticed everything now. Did you need something from my bag? I asked calmly. Vanessa blinked immediately. What? No. Interesting. I picked up the purse slowly. You looked concerned about it. Her cheeks flushed faintly. You are reading too much into things again. Again. Another word people use when they hope patterns will be dismissed as imagination. Am I? I asked quietly. She crossed her arms. Margaret, I really think all this tension is unnecessary. I studied her carefully for several seconds before answering. Do you know what unnecessary tension feels like? She frowned slightly. What? Driving someone else's vehicle after midnight without permission. Complete silence. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Just for a second. But it was enough. I do not know what you are talking about, she said carefully. I reached into my purse and placed the gas station receipt on the counter between us. Time almost seemed to pause. Vanessa stared at the receipt without touching it. I found that inside my Lexus this morning, I said calmly. Would you like to explain why my car was being driven at 12:43 in the morning? Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For the first time since all of this began, Vanessa truly looked nervous. Not offended. Not annoyed. Nervous. And that was when I realized something important. She had become so comfortable crossing boundaries that she stopped believing anyone would ever challenge her with evidence. Vanessa recovered faster than most people would have. That was the dangerous thing about her. She did not panic easily. She adapted. The moment her eyes landed on that gas station receipt, I watched her brain begin calculating explanations in real time. "I drove to pick up medicine for Ethan," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled now. "He had a migraine." I looked at her quietly. "At 12:43 in the morning?" She crossed her arms tighter. "The pharmacy near Ridgeway stays open late." Another polished answer. Almost believable. Except Ethan hated taking medication unless absolutely necessary. And more. Importantly, she still had not explained why she needed my vehicle to do it. "Interesting," I said softly, because Ethan never mentioned being sick. Vanessa's jaw tightened again. Not everything revolves around you needing an explanation. There it was. The shift. Whenever calm manipulation stopped working, irritation surfaced underneath. I nodded slowly and folded the receipt back into my purse. "You are right," I answered. "I do not need explanations anymore. I need boundaries." That sentence unsettled her more than anger would have. I could see it immediately. Because boundaries create consequences. And consequences are terrifying to people who built comfort on unchecked access. Ethan came downstairs a few minutes later carrying laundry from upstairs, completely unaware of the tension hanging between us. "Everything okay?" he asked automatically. Vanessa answered before I could. "Your mother thinks I am some kind of criminal now." Interesting how quickly accountability becomes persecution in certain people's minds. Ethan looked exhausted instantly. "Mom!" I raised one hand gently. "I am not interested in arguing." Then I picked up my purse and keys. "I will be out for a few hours." Ethan frowned. "Where are you going?" "To handle personal matters." Vanessa watched me carefully as I walked toward the front door. Not angry anymore. Concerned. Because uncertainty makes entitled people nervous. They prefer predictable victims. People who react emotionally in ways they can manage. But calmness creates mystery. And mystery removes control. I drove directly from the house to Brookhaven Credit Union where Walter and I had banked for nearly 40 years. The branch manager, Denise Holloway, greeted me warmly and immediately offered coffee when I asked for a private office. Denise was around my age and possessed the kind of calm intelligence women develop after decades of watching families quietly fall apart over money. "You look serious today," she said gently once we sat down. "I think I have been careless," I admitted. Then once again I explained everything. The car. The missing key. The increasing entitlement inside my home. Denise listened carefully before opening my account information on her computer. "Margaret," she said after several minutes, "did you authorize a secondary household access inquiry last month?" My stomach dropped instantly. "A what?" Denise turned the monitor slightly toward me. "Someone requested information about adding an authorized family contact for emergency account communication." The room suddenly felt colder. "Who requested it?" Denise hesitated briefly. "Your son came in with his wife approximately 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago. While I was volunteering at St. Matthew's charity luncheon downtown. I remembered the exact day because Vanessa had asked strange questions that evening about how Walter originally structured our retirement accounts. At the time I thought she was making conversation. Now I understood she had likely already seen documentation. Were they given access? I asked quietly. Denise shook her head immediately. "Absolutely not. We contacted you twice for confirmation and received no response." My chest tightened. "I never received any messages." Denise frowned and clicked through notification records. Both messages were sent through the email address, ending in Whitmore Family Home at Outlook. My blood ran cold. That shared household email address sat on the kitchen desktop computer downstairs. Vanessa had access to it, which meant she could easily delete messages before I ever saw them. Denise's expression changed slowly as realization crossed her face too. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I strongly recommend updating all account communication immediately." I nodded silently, not shocked anymore, just clearer. Everything was escalating exactly the way Richard warned me it would. Small boundary violations becoming larger ones. Casual access evolving into attempts at institutional authority. "I would also suggest removing all shared account visibility," Denise continued gently, especially if household dynamics are changing. Household dynamics. Another polite professional phrase hiding painful truths. I spent nearly 2 hours at the bank updating passwords, communication methods, emergency contacts, and account protections. By the time I walked back into the parking lot, I felt emotionally exhausted but strangely stronger too. Like someone finally waking up after years of sleepwalking. On the drive home, I stopped at a small hardware store and purchased a new lock for the upstairs hallway closet. Not because I believed a lock alone would solve anything, but because visible boundaries matter. They force people to acknowledge ownership directly instead of pretending access is automatic. When I returned home around 4 in the afternoon, Vanessa's SUV was gone but Ethan's sedan remained parked outside. I carried the new lock quietly upstairs and began replacing the old one while soft music played from Ethan's office down the hallway. Halfway through tightening the final screw, I heard his footsteps approach behind me. "What are you doing?" he asked, confused. I looked up calmly. "Changing the closet lock." Ethan frowned immediately. "Why?" "Because someone accessed private documents without permission." He exhaled sharply. "Mom, seriously?" I stood slowly and faced him directly. "Do you know what concerns me most right now?" Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I do not know. Probably something Vanessa did accidentally, that you are turning into a conspiracy." That sentence settled over me heavily. Not because it was cruel. Because it revealed how determined Ethan had become to avoid reality altogether. "Your wife deleted bank notifications addressed to me," I said quietly. His expression froze instantly. "What?" "Someone used the shared household email to remove messages regarding unauthorized account access inquiries." Ethan stared at me silently for several seconds. "You do not know Vanessa did that?" "No," I agreed softly. "I know somebody inside this house did." Ethan looked genuinely shaken now. Good. Because discomfort was the first honest emotion I had seen from him in weeks. "Why would she do that?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze steadily. "I think you already know the answer." He looked away immediately. That was all the confirmation I needed. Not proof. Recognition. Deep down, Ethan understood exactly how far things had gone. He simply lacked the courage to confront it directly. A car door slammed outside. Moments later, followed by Vanessa entering through the garage carrying shopping bags again. Ethan stepped away from me instantly like a teenager caught between divorced parents. Vanessa climbed the stairs smiling until she saw the new lock installed on the hallway closet. Her expression changed immediately. "What is that?" she asked sharply. "A lock," I answered pleasantly. "I can see that," she snapped. "Why did you change it?" I looked directly at her. "Because not everyone in this house understands the difference between access and ownership." Silence filled the hallway. Ethan said nothing. Vanessa stared at me for several long seconds before laughing once under her breath. But there was no humor in it now. "You are unbelievable lately," she muttered.
No, iyan suarat sufli.
I think I have finally become believable to myself. And for the first time since this all began, Vanessa looked at me not like an inconvenience, not like an emotional old woman, but like a problem she no longer fully understood how to control. The moment people realize access is disappearing, they start revealing who they really are. I noticed it immediately after changing the lock upstairs. Vanessa stopped pretending to be warm. The polite smiles became thinner. Her voice sharpened around the edges. Even the way she walked through the house changed. Faster. More irritated. Like someone suddenly aware that invisible doors were beginning to close. Tuesday morning arrived unusually bright after several days of rain, and sunlight spilled across the kitchen counters while I prepared oatmeal quietly before sunrise. The house felt tense even in silence. That happens when people living under the same roof stop trusting each other emotionally. Every cabinet door closes harder. Every conversation becomes shorter. Every movement feels observed. Around 7 o'clock, Vanessa entered the kitchen dressed for work in a navy blazer and heels, already speaking sharply into her phone. "No, tell them we need the revised estimate before Friday," she snapped while opening the refrigerator. Then she saw me and immediately lowered her voice. "Interesting." She ended the call quickly and set her phone down. Harder than necessary. "Morning," she said flatly. "Good morning," I answered calmly. She grabbed bottled water from the refrigerator and stared at the new keypad lockbox I had installed beside the pantry wall the night before. Another visible boundary. Another reminder that access now required permission. You really went all in with this security thing, she muttered. I believe privacy matters, I replied. She laughed softly under her breath. Nobody is trying to rob you, Margaret. That sentence lingered in the air strangely, because theft is not always financial. Sometimes people slowly steal authority, space, stability, peace, the right to feel safe inside your own home. Ethan came downstairs moments later, adjusting his tie again while scrolling through work emails. He looked exhausted lately. Not because of me. Because avoidance eventually drains people dry. Maintaining denial requires constant energy. Morning, he muttered. Vanessa kissed his cheek quickly but kept glancing toward me. Calculating. Watching. I might need the Lexus Friday, she said casually while stirring cream into coffee. Ethan froze slightly. I almost smiled at how quickly both of them had become aware of permission again. For what? I asked softly. Vanessa folded her arms. My office is hosting clients downtown. Then use your SUV. Mine needs servicing. I nodded slowly. Then perhaps a rental vehicle would make sense. Silence. Ethan stared down into his coffee cup while Vanessa's expression tightened visibly now. Seriously, she asked. You are still doing this? Doing what? Punishing me over a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Such a fascinating word for repeated entitlement.
No, Ian Suarat calmly.
I am adjusting boundaries based on behavior. Vanessa let out a sharp breath through her nose and grabbed her purse. This house has become exhausting lately. Then she walked toward the garage door. Ethan waited until the door closed before finally speaking. Mom, do you really think all of this is helping? I looked at him quietly. Helping what? The family. There it was again. The assumption that preserving comfort mattered more than preserving respect. Ethan, I asked gently, when exactly did keeping peace become more important to you than protecting truth? He looked away immediately. It is not like that. Then explain it to me. He could not, because deep down Ethan understood something painful now. His wife had crossed lines repeatedly, and instead of confronting it, he had spent years asking me to tolerate it quietly so his own life remained easier. He left for work without finishing breakfast. Another uncomfortable silence hanging between us like unfinished business. By noon I was sitting inside Richard Meyer's office again reviewing updated estate paperwork. Richard studied several documents while reading glasses rested low on his nose. Everything is still legally secure, he said finally. The property, vehicle, and investment accounts remain solely yours. Relief loosened my chest slightly. But, he continued carefully, I strongly recommend formalizing future protections immediately. I understood exactly what he meant. You think things will escalate. Richard removed his glasses slowly. Margaret, people rarely test one boundary at a time. Once entitlement becomes normalized, escalation follows naturally. I thought about Vanessa standing in my garage after midnight holding my spare key. About deleted bank messages. About conversations regarding renovations to a home I was still living in. What would you recommend? I asked quietly. Richard slid a folder across the desk. A revocable living trust update. Immediate revocation of informal household access assumptions. Undocumented vehicle usage restrictions. Vehicle usage restrictions. Such professional wording for a painful truth. My own family needed legal clarification that my car belonged to me. There is one more thing, Richard added carefully. I hired a private title monitoring service this morning as a precaution. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? It alerts us if anyone attempts unauthorized changes involving your property records, vehicle title inquiries, or ownership transfers. My stomach tightened instantly. You think somebody might actually attempt that? Richard's expression remained calm. I think caution is wiser than denial. I left his office carrying another stack of paperwork and an uncomfortable awareness that this situation had moved beyond hurt feelings. This was now about protection. Real protection. On the drive home my phone buzzed through the Lexus speakers. Carol's name appeared on the dashboard screen. Margaret, she said the moment I answered. I hope you do not mind me asking something strange. What is it? I saw Vanessa at Brookhaven Auto Services this morning. My grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel.
Autoservice.
Yes. She was speaking with one of the financing managers when I dropped my car off. I only noticed because she was standing beside your Lexus. Cold silence settled through my chest instantly. Did you hear what they discussed? Not really, Carol answered carefully. But I remember hearing her mention wanting to understand the trade-in value and loan balance options. Loan balance options. Trade-in value. My vision sharpened instantly while the road stretched silently ahead of me. Vanessa had been asking questions about my vehicle financially. Not borrowing it. Positioning around it. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. Of course, Carol replied gently. I just thought it seemed odd. Odd? No. Strategic. I drove straight home without stopping anywhere else. Vanessa's SUV sat in the driveway now, meaning she had returned from work early. When I entered through the garage door, I immediately heard raised voices upstairs. Ethan and Vanessa were arguing. I paused quietly near the staircase as their words drifted downward. You said she would calm down, Vanessa snapped. Ethan answered more quietly but sounded frustrated. Because normally she does. Silence followed briefly before Vanessa spoke again. Well, she is acting paranoid now. Paranoid. Another predictable label for women who begin noticing patterns clearly. You went through her paperwork, Ethan said suddenly. My entire body went still. Silence upstairs. Then Vanessa's voice lowered sharply. Keep your voice down. Did you? Ethan pressed. I was trying to understand what situation we are dealing with financially, Vanessa answered defensively. That is not the same thing. Financially. Situation. The words settled together like pieces finally locking into place. This had never been random entitlement. Vanessa was evaluating assets, access, long-term control. Ethan spoke again, quieter now. You should not have done that. Oh please, Vanessa snapped. Your mother acts like I stole from her because I borrowed a car. Borrowed. Even now she framed repeated access violations as harmless favors. This would all be easier if she trusted us, Vanessa continued bitterly. No, Ethan said softly after a long silence. I think this would all be easier if we stopped acting like everything she owns already belongs to us. That sentence shocked me more than anything else I had heard in weeks. Because for the first time my son had finally said the truth out loud. Hearing the truth spoken out loud changes something inside a family forever. I remained frozen near the staircase after Ethan admitted what nobody else had been willing to say directly. I think this would all be easier if we stopped acting like everything she owns already belongs to us. Silence followed upstairs so heavy it almost felt physical. Then Vanessa laughed once. Sharp. Disbelieving. Wow, she said coldly. So now you are taking her side? This is not about sides, Ethan answered quietly. Then what is it about? She snapped. Because lately your mother treats me like some kind of thief. I stayed perfectly still listening while my son struggled for words. Vanessa, he said finally, you went through her paperwork. Because somebody in this house has to think ahead. She shot back immediately. Your mother refuses to discuss anything practical. Practical. Such an interesting word for entitlement disguised as responsibility. You do not understand how expensive everything is right now, Vanessa continued. Mortgage rates, inflation, insurance, groceries. We are drowning financially while she sits on this giant house and luxury car acting like boundaries matter more than family. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the money. Because for the first time, Vanessa stopped pretending affection motivated her behavior. This was about lifestyle, security, access. It is her house, Ethan said weakly. For now, Vanessa muttered. Silence exploded after that. Even she seemed to realize she had finally said too much out loud. My chest tightened painfully while I stood there gripping the staircase railing. For now. Not someday naturally after a long happy life. Not years from now after mutual love and trust. For now. Like my existence itself had become temporary paperwork delaying their future comfort. Ethan spoke again eventually, but his voice sounded shaken now. Do you hear yourself? Vanessa exhaled sharply. I am being realistic.
No, Ethan replied quietly.
You are acting entitled. I closed my eyes briefly at that word. Entitled. Finally. Someone else had spoken it besides me. The argument upstairs continued in lower voices after that, but I quietly walked away before hearing more. Not because I feared the truth anymore. Because I had already heard enough. I sat alone in Walter's old study for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the framed photographs lining the shelves. Ethan at 10 years old holding his first fishing pole beside Walter at Lake Harmon. Ethan graduating college while I cried through the ceremony. Ethan smiling beside Vanessa on their wedding day before life became complicated by expectations and disappointments. Somewhere between those moments and now, gratitude had quietly transformed into assumption. An assumption eventually became entitlement. Around 8 that evening, Ethan knocked softly on the study door. Mom! I looked up calmly. He stepped inside looking emotionally exhausted. Can we talk? Of course. He sat across from me in Walter's old reading chair and rubbed both hands down his face slowly before speaking. You heard us upstairs, did you not? Some of it. He stared down at the carpet for several seconds. I did not know things had gotten this bad. I studied my son quietly. Really? He looked up sharply. That is not fair.
No, he answered softly.
What was not fair was asking me for years to ignore behavior you secretly knew was wrong, because confrontation made you uncomfortable. Ethan flinched slightly at that. Not angry. Wounded. Which meant the truth had finally reached him. I never wanted you to feel disrespected, he said quietly. Intentions matter less than patterns, I replied. Silence settled between us again. Then Ethan asked the question I think he had been avoiding internally for weeks. Do you really think Vanessa was trying to take advantage of you? I almost laughed sadly at how carefully he phrased it. Trying to. As though the attempt itself remained uncertain despite everything already happening. I think your wife became very comfortable treating my life like future inventory, I answered honestly. Ethan looked physically ill hearing that sentence. Good. Some truths should feel uncomfortable. She has been under pressure financially, he said weakly. We both have. And whose responsibility is that? I asked gently. He had no answer. Because adulthood becomes dangerous the moment people start believing someone else's stability exists to absorb the consequences of their own choices. Mom, he said after a long silence, I never wanted you to think we only cared about your money. Money. Funny how he still reduced it to that. This was never about money, Ethan, I said quietly. It was about respect. His eyes lowered again immediately, because deep down he knew exactly when respect disappeared. The first time Vanessa borrowed things without asking and he said nothing. The first time she invited people into my home without permission. The first time she referred to my property as theirs while he stayed silent beside her. Small moments. Tiny compromises. That is how boundaries die inside families. Not through one terrible act. Through repeated tolerated ones. Ethan finally stood slowly. What are you going to do? There it was. The question everyone eventually asks once consequences begin approaching. I looked toward Walter's photograph on the bookshelf before answering. I am going to protect myself. Ethan nodded faintly like he expected that answer. But then he surprised me. You probably should. After he left the study, I sat alone for another hour listening to the quiet hum of the house. Vanessa never came downstairs that evening. Around 10:30 I heard their bedroom door close sharply upstairs, followed by muffled movement for nearly an hour. Separate pacing. Separate footsteps. Even without hearing words, I knew tension had settled between them now too. Entitlement rarely survives comfortably once exposed directly to daylight. Wednesday morning arrived colder than expected. Autumn had finally started settling properly across Brookhaven, and frost lined the edges of the front lawn while I carried coffee onto the back patio wrapped in Walter's old wool cardigan. For the first time in weeks, the house felt almost peaceful. Not warm, but clearer. Then my phone rang. Richard Myers. Margaret, he said immediately, his voice unusually serious. I need you to come by the office today. My stomach tightened instantly. What happened? We received an alert through the title monitoring service this morning. Every nerve in my body sharpened immediately. An alert for what? Richard paused briefly before answering. Someone attempted to request preliminary information regarding a vehicle ownership transfer involving your Lexus yesterday afternoon. Cold silence spread through me completely. What does that mean exactly? It means somebody was exploring what documentation would be required to transfer or refinance your vehicle. I closed my eyes slowly.
Brookhaven Autoservice.
Trade-in value inquiries.
Financing discussion.
The missing spare key. The late-night driving. Suddenly every scattered detail aligned into one clear picture. Can they do anything without my signature? I asked quietly.
No, Richard answered firmly.
Not legally. But Margaret, this confirms something important. What? His voice lowered carefully. This situation is no longer emotional boundary confusion. Somebody has begun exploring ownership transition actively. Ownership transition. Such clean legal language for betrayal. I ended the call and sat frozen on the patio while cold wind rustled dead leaves across the yard. Inside the house I heard Vanessa moving around upstairs getting ready for work. Humming softly. Completely unaware that her private calculations had finally become visible outside the family walls. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped feeling hurt entirely. What replaced it was something much more dangerous. Clarity.